What if progress doesn't always arrive because it can, but because it's allowed to? Picture a warehouse at the edge of an American city, the kind with a faded sign, a padlock the color of old pennies, and a thin line of dust that never seems to move. Inside, the air smells like cardboard and machine oil. There are shelves, metal tables, and unlabeled crates. In a corner, a stack of brittle photographs. In another, a spool of wire, a cracked lens, a yellowing memo stamped "Confidential." The room feels less like a storeroom and more like an attic for the future, where ideas go when they don't fit the era that finds them. We like to imagine invention as a straight line. Curiosity meets need. A breakthrough appears. Society adopts it. The world changes, but history, when you look closely, has more detours than highways. Some discoveries arrive early, like seeds thrown onto frozen ground. Some arrive with promise and then vanish, dismantled, discredited, regulated into irrelevance, or simply forgotten beneath the noise of what's easier to sell. This is not a story about villains in capes or secret rooms where the world is directed like a puppet show. Reality is usually more ordinary and more unsettling. It's about incentives. It's about institutions that move slowly. It's about markets that reward replacement over repair, convenience over stewardship, short-term certainty over long-term transformation. And it's about people, engineers, farmers, doctors, factory workers who catch a glimpse of a different path, only to watch it fade. Across the last century, there have been moments when something nearly impossible became briefly plausible. A car body grown from fields instead of mined from the earth. A light that could burn for years without surrendering to darkness. Cities stitched together by quiet electric transit instead of exhaust and gridlock. Materials designed to endure and systems designed to loop back on themselves so waste became fuel and leftovers became soil. At first glance, these sound like fairy tales we tell ourselves to cope with the mess we've made. But some of them were prototypes. Some were pilot programs. Some were real. Working solutions, imperfect, yes, but tangible enough to frighten industries built on the opposite assumption, that things should wear out, be replaced, be thrown away, and sold again. And so the question becomes less romantic, more human, and more difficult. When a discovery threatens the way the world currently pays its bills, what happens to the discovery? Sometimes it's welcomed, but reshaped, rounded into something less disruptive. Sometimes it's smothered by bureaucracy, not by malice, but by momentum. Sometimes it's attacked in public while quietly studied in private. Sometimes it's dismissed as impractical, not because it can't work, but because it can't fit inside the existing machinery of permits, supply chains, liability, and profit margins. In this series, we're going to walk through 10 stories that live in that grey terrain between innovation and disappearance. We'll move from the early 20th century to the present, from laboratories to city streets, from farms to factories. Along the way, we'll hold two truths at once. First, extraordinary claims deserve careful handling. Not every dramatic story survives scrutiny, and not every abandoned idea was abandoned unfairly. Second, the world is shaped as much by what gets adopted as by what gets ignored. Our aim isn't to declare a hidden history with absolute certainty. It's to explore a pattern that repeats often enough to feel like a lesson. That progress is not only a matter of what humans can imagine, it's also a matter of what humans are willing to reorganize their lives around. Because even the best ideas ask something of us. They demand new skills, new rules, new habits. They threaten old investments. They make the familiar feel unstable. And in times of uncertainty, stability, however flawed, can be more seductive than change. So tonight, think of that warehouse again. Think of those crates and photographs. Think of a world where the future isn't a single destination, but a branching forest of paths, some taken, some blocked, some abandoned before we even knew their names. If a discovery can change everything, who decides whether it gets the chance? And if the past contains doors we quietly closed, what does it say about the doors we're closing right now? What if the first suppressed discovery wasn't a device at all, but a plant? In the late 1930s, the Midwest had a particular kind of winter light. Low sun, long shadows, and fields resting under a hard, pale sky. In Dearborn, Michigan, inside an industrial campus that smelled of steel and ambition, Henry Ford looked out at a world built from ore and oil and wondered if it could be built from soil. Ford had grown up around farms. He understood the steady logic of harvests. You plant, you tend, you take what the land offers, and you begin again. Factories, by contrast, felt like a one-way road. You dig, you smelt, you stamp, you discard. The system ate raw materials like a fire eats wood. And Ford, ever the practical dreamer, asked an inconvenient question. Could the raw materials of modern life be grown back? He wasn't alone. Chemists and tinkerers had been experimenting with plant-based plastics and fibers for years. But Ford's name gave the idea weight. He assembled a team to investigate chemergy, the marriage of chemistry and agriculture. The promise was simple and radical. If you could make industrial materials from crops, you could stabilize farm income, reduce dependency on mined resources, and create a manufacturing loop that felt more like nature, renewable, seasonal, forgiving. The most famous result was a prototype car body panel made from a composite that included plant fibers. Depending on the telling, the ingredients varied. Soybeans, wheat straw, hemp, and other agricultural matter were all part of the broader experimentation. What matters is not the exact recipe, but the direction of the thinking. This wasn't about novelty, it was about resilience. A car that could be partly grown meant a supply chain less vulnerable to shortages and a countryside less vulnerable to collapse. There are photographs from that era. A dark vehicle under bright lights, men in suits standing close as if warmth could be borrowed from innovation. In one oft-repeated demonstration, Ford is said to have swung an axe at the trunk or panel to show toughness. Whether every detail is perfectly preserved doesn't change the larger truth. The concept was real enough to be built, tested, and shown. A farm could become a factory's partner, not its victim. And then the world changed shape. War reorganized priorities. Materials were rationed. Factories became engines for military production. After the war, the planet entered a new bargain. Cheap oil, cheap plastics, and an economy designed for acceleration. Petrochemicals flooded the market with materials that were uniform, scalable, and profitable. Agriculture, instead of becoming the source of industrial materials, was reorganized to feed that same system. Producing commodity crops in volumes that fit global trade, not local ecosystems. Plant-based industrial materials didn't vanish because they were impossible. They faded because the other path became easier. The infrastructure for oil-based plastics expanded quickly. Pipelines, refineries, chemical plants, distribution networks. Once those were in place, the world began to orbit them. A new kind of gravity formed. It pulled engineers toward petroleum solutions, pulled lawmakers toward petroleum tax bases, pulled consumers toward petroleum-priced convenience. There was also a quieter problem. Plant-based materials tied industry to seasons and soil health. They demanded coordination between farmers and manufacturers. They required patience, experimentation, and regional thinking. Petrochemicals offered something that looked like freedom. Consistent inputs, predictable costs, and the illusion that the ground beneath our feet didn't matter. In hindsight, Ford's experiment reads like a postcard from a road not taken, a reminder that innovation isn't only about what's new, but about what kind of relationship we want with the planet that supplies us. The prototype didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. It only needed to point. Because once you've seen that a car can be partially grown, you start to notice how many other things could have been grown too. Insulation, packaging, textiles, building panels, objects meant to last, and objects meant to return safely to the earth. And that leaves us with a question that lingers like the scent of cut stalks in late autumn. If a solution asks us to slow down and cooperate with nature's pace, do we call it impractical because it fails the test of physics, or because it fails the test of our appetites? What if the most successful invention in your home was designed to die? On a winter evening, you can feel the truth of electricity without thinking about it. A lamp clicks on, a room fills with warmth. Shadows retreat to corners, like polite guests. Light feels like a promise, steady, modern, almost moral. We grow up believing it's supposed to last. And yet, for much of the last century, the story of electric light has carried a strange, quiet contradiction. The better the bulb, the more dangerous it became to the business that sold it. In the early decades of electrification, engineers treated durability as a badge of honor. They experimented with filaments, gases, glass thickness, and manufacturing techniques, always aiming for a brighter lamp that would hold on longer. Some bulbs did. There are stories, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes grounded in real examples of early lamps that ran for astonishing spans of time under certain conditions. The exact hours vary with voltage, filament design, heat management, and the simple luck of manufacturing. But the concept is what matters. Long life was technically plausible. And then the marketplace began to speak. Imagine a boardroom in the 1920s. Polished wood, cigarette smoke, men in dark suits studying charts that look less like engineering and more like prophecy. Electric lighting companies had invested heavily in factories and distribution. They needed a stable, predictable flow of sales to justify expansion. A bulb that lasted too long threatened that rhythm. If every household bought a few lamps that never failed, what would happen to the business built to keep selling replacements? This is where the idea of planned obsolescence, whether spoken aloud or simply practiced, begins to take shape, not as a cartoonish plot, but as a strategy that can emerge naturally when growth becomes the goal rather than service. Companies compete, then they consolidate, they standardize, they measure, they optimize, and sometimes optimization includes the deliberate narrowing of a product's lifespan to keep the market moving. In popular history, the best-known symbol of this dynamic is the global effort to standardize incandescent bulb lifespans around a certain number of hours. The story is often told as a turning point, a moment when durability stopped being a pure engineering target and became a variable in a business equation. How tightly this was enforced and how universally is complex. Technology was changing anyway. Newer designs balanced brightness, efficiency, cost, and reliability. But the broader pattern is hard to ignore. Longevity became negotiable. And once longevity becomes negotiable, a door opens. It's not just about light bulbs, it's about the philosophy that spreads outward from them. If products can be tuned to fail at predictable intervals, then the economy can be tuned to churn. Replacement becomes normal. Repair becomes rare. The consumer becomes a steady stream rather than a person. Here's the haunting part. Most of us can feel this in our daily lives without knowing the history. A phone battery that fades sooner than it should. A kitchen appliance that breaks just past the warranty. A printer that refuses to work because of a chip, not a mechanical failure. We adapt, shrug, buy again. The system doesn't need secrecy, it needs habit. Yet in the case of the light bulb, the irony cuts deeper because light is symbolic. Light is what we reach for when we're afraid. Light is what we associate with knowledge, clarity, safety. To learn that light itself, this most basic comfort, can be shaped by economic incentives is to realize something unsettling. Even the things that feel like pure progress are filtered through the question of who benefits. But the point isn't to romanticize an earlier age or claim that a single immortal bulb was stolen from the world. Reality is messier. Some long-lived bulbs are dimmer, run cooler, or operate under ideal conditions. Some are anomalies, not templates for mass production. Still, the central tension remains true. There are moments when our ability to make something better collides with our willingness to build an economy that can survive it. So stand in a lit room and listen, really listen, to the faint hum of modern life. The glow feels stable, but the system behind it often depends on instability, on things wearing down, breaking, expiring, being replaced. Which raises a question as old as the first fire and as modern as the latest upgrade. When we choose products that don't last, are we paying for convenience? Or are we paying for an economy that no longer remembers how to value permanence? What if the future once ran on rails and we tore up the tracks ourselves? Stand in the middle of a wide American boulevard today and try to imagine what used to be there. Not just asphalt and painted lanes, but steel lines embedded in the street like seams. A streetcar gliding in, bell chiming softly, doors folding open with a sigh, people stepping on with groceries, briefcases, tired children. A city moving with a kind of shared rhythm, where mobility was less a private possession and more a public pulse. In the early 20th century, many American cities were stitched together by electric streetcar networks. They weren't perfect. They could be crowded, slow, underfunded. They depended on maintenance and political will. But they offered something profound, a way to scale movement without scaling isolation. You didn't need every person to own a machine. You needed a system that belonged to everyone. Then, gradually, the rails began to disappear. If you ask why, you'll get more than one answer, because the truth isn't a single lever pulled in secret. Part of it was money. Streetcar companies often struggled under fare caps and aging infrastructure. Part of it was preference. The car promised freedom. Leave when you want, go where you want, carry what you want. And part of it was the shape of cities themselves. As suburbs expanded, distances grew, and rail lines that once made sense began to feel like relics in neighborhoods built for driveways, not sidewalks. But there is also a story that keeps resurfacing, not because it proves a grand plot, but because it reveals how incentives can steer a society. In the mid-century years, a group of corporate interests did help buy up streetcar lines in various cities and convert them to buses. That much is documented. The motives and how decisive the impact was are debated. Some call it deliberate dismantling. Others Call it opportunistic business in a system already failing. Either way, the result felt the same on the street. The streetcar vanished, and the city began to reorganize around the automobile. Buses were flexible, yes. They didn't require rails, but flexibility can also mean fragility. A bus shares traffic with cars. It gets stuck in the same congestion. It competes for road space. It doesn't control. Rails, by contrast, declare permanence. They are a physical commitment. We are building a future where people will move together. And when rails are removed, something else is removed with them, a form of collective confidence. The automobile didn't just replace the streetcar, it rewrote the social contract of distance. Work moved farther from home. Shopping centers drifted away from neighborhoods. Sidewalks narrowed. Public space thinned. Children grew less free to roam. The air took on a new taste, faint but constant. Cities became louder, and the simple act of getting somewhere became an individual responsibility, not a shared service. This isn't nostalgia for a golden age that never existed. Streetcars were often privately run, sometimes exploitative, and far from universally accessible. But they represented a different premise, that transportation could be a public utility as essential as water or power. That premise weakened, and in its place grew a nation of steering wheels. And here's the strange part. The electric streetcar was, in a sense, an early version of what we now chase again. Clean transit, efficient urban movement, the reduction of exhaust, the idea that a city can be designed for people rather than parking. So the question isn't whether a conspiracy stole the streetcar from America. The deeper question is what it means that we allowed a public system to erode while building an economy that depended on the private alternative. Because once the car becomes the default, everything else must justify itself. Transit lines, bike lanes, walkable streets, even the concept of living close enough to work that you don't need to drive at all. The future becomes a series of individual purchases. And that leaves us with a haunting thought, one that feels like hearing a bell from a street you can no longer find. If a city can forget it once moved together, how many other kinds of togetherness can a society forget and call it progress? What if the most radical technology on Earth is a simple loop? Before sunrise on a farm, the world is mostly sound. A barn door groans. A bucket scrapes concrete. Chickens announce themselves as if they invented morning. The air is cold enough to sharpen every breath. And somewhere in that half-light, long before any spreadsheet or quarterly report, an old principle quietly insists on being true. On a healthy farm, nothing is supposed to be wasted. For most of human history, agriculture was a cycle. Crop residues fed animals. Manure fed soil. Kitchen scraps fed compost. Water was reused. Energy was captured where possible. Wood, wind, muscle, sun. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. The farm, at its best, behaved like an ecosystem, not efficient in the slick industrial sense, but resilient in the way forests are resilient, because everything has a second purpose. Then modern agriculture became something else. By the late 20th century, the dominant model in many places, especially in wealthy nations, shifted towards specialization at scale. One farm grew only corn. Another raised only hogs. Another produced only milk. Inputs traveled in. Products traveled out. The middle, so where one output becomes the next input, thinned and then snapped. Fertilizers replaced compost. Feed replaced pasture. Pesticides replaced biodiversity. Waste became waste, not fuel. And yet, Every few decades, someone rediscovers the loop. Engineers call it integrated farming or closed-loop systems. Farmers might call it common sense with modern tools. The idea is straightforward. Link plants and animals and waste streams, so the farm produces not only food, but also its own fertility and a portion of its own energy. Manure goes into anaerobic digesters to make biogas. Digestate becomes fertilizer. Crop residues become bedding, compost, or feed. Food waste becomes input, carefully processed, safely handled, turned into nourishment instead of landfill methane. Water cycles through ponds and filters. Heat from one process warms another. In trials and in real-world examples, these systems can reduce reliance on purchased fertilizers, cut fuel costs, lower odor and runoff, and stabilize a farm against price shocks. They don't eliminate every problem. They require expertise, monitoring, and investment. But they offer a different bargain. Less dependence, more self-sufficiency, fewer external chemicals, and less waste. So why aren't they everywhere? The answer isn't a single villain. It's a maze. Some barriers are practical. A digester is expensive. Maintenance matters. One failure can sour a community. Markets are built for commodities, not for loops. A farm that makes its own fertilizer doesn't show up as demand in the fertilizer market, and lenders don't always know how to value that kind of savings. Big systems get attention. Distributed systems often don't. Other barriers come from rules, often written with good intentions, sometimes applied with blunt force. Food safety is real. Disease prevention is real. Environmental protection is real. And yet, regulations designed for industrial-scale operations can accidentally punish smaller, circular approaches. Permitting for biogas can be complex. Using certain waste streams as feed can trigger strict prohibitions. Zoning can separate animals from crops, making integration harder. Insurance can treat innovation as risk, even when the risk is manageable. In other words, the loop doesn't only have to work technically. It has to fit inside the legal and financial architecture built around the straight line. And straight lines are easier to count. A bag of fertilizer is a transaction. A pesticide application is a transaction. A feed shipment is a transaction. A loan for more equipment is a transaction. Our economy reads these as signals of productivity. But a loop is quieter. It looks, on paper, like less activity, fewer purchases, fewer shipments, fewer dependencies. It can be harder to monetize, harder to tax, harder to scale in the way modern business loves to scale. There's also a cultural weight. For decades, farmers were taught that modernity meant specialization, that efficiency meant focusing on one thing and doing it bigger. Integrated systems can look like going backward when they are, in fact, moving sideways toward a different definition of progress. If you stand on a farm that still behaves like an ecosystem, you can feel the difference. The soil holds together. The air smells less chemical, more alive. The work is complicated, but the logic is clear. Waste has a destination. Inputs have an alternative. The farm becomes less a factory and more a living machine. And that leads to a question that's uncomfortable precisely because it's so ordinary. If a solution reduces purchases instead of increasing them, do we call it inefficient? Or do we quietly label it unrealistic because it threatens the way we've learned to measure success? What if the cleanest energy source is the one you've already paid for, twice? At night, a city is a constellation built on loss. Look down from an airplane and you'll see it. Highways glowing, office towers lit like lanterns, neighborhoods dotted with porch lights, and blue television flicker. It's beautiful from above, almost tender. But there's another way to see it, less poetic, more sobering. Every bright patch is a leak. Energy enters our lives with ceremony. It's mined, drilled, shipped, burned, converted, transmitted. Entire landscapes are rearranged so a switch can be flipped in a kitchen. We pay for it with money, yes, but also with air quality, water, heat trapped in the atmosphere, and the slow erosion of places we rarely visit. And then, once it arrives, we waste more of it than most people realize. Not because we're careless, but because the systems around us were designed when waste felt cheap. There is a type of invention that doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like a valve, a heat exchanger, a clever pipe. It doesn't promise a new world. It promises to stop throwing the old one away. Waste heat recovery is the quiet art of capturing the energy that escapes from factories, power plants, engines, and even data centers, turning it into usable electricity or heat for nearby buildings. The principle is almost embarrassingly simple. When anything runs, it generates heat. Most of that heat dissipates into the air or water. If you can intercept it through turbines, organic Rankine cycle systems, thermoelectric materials, or direct heat networks, you can reuse it. And in certain settings, it works. Steel mills, cement plants, refineries, large-scale manufacturing, these places bleed heat like a wound. In colder climates, even city infrastructure can become a kind of circulating warmth. Subways, sewage, industrial exhaust. Some campuses and districts have built networks that share heat between buildings, so one facility's waste becomes another's comfort. If you've ever stood behind a restaurant kitchen in winter and felt the warm air pushing out of a vent, you've felt the idea in your bones. Multiply that by 1,000. Multiply it by an industrial park. You begin to understand the scale of what slips away. So why does the city still glow with loss? Because waste heat recovery requires coordination, and coordination is hard. An oil well can be owned, a pipeline can be owned, a refinery can be owned. But waste heat often sits at the boundary between entities. A factory produces it. A neighborhood could use it. Between them is a tangle of ownership, permitting, trenching, upfront capital, liability, and timing. The factory might be leased. The neighborhood might change. The company might relocate. The payback period might be longer than the average executive's tenure. The easiest choice is to vent the heat and move on. There's also a more subtle barrier. Energy markets often reward production more than conservation. Building a new power plant is dramatic. Cutting demand with efficiency is invisible. Capturing waste heat can reduce the need for fuel, which can reduce revenue for those who sell fuel. Even when the numbers are good, the story is less exciting. Politicians like ribbon cuttings. Investors like growth curves. Waste heat recovery offers something different. Fewer ribbons, flatter curves, and a quieter kind of prosperity. And then there is our modern mythology, that progress comes from new sources, not from new discipline. We dream of breakthrough batteries, exotic fusion, miracle fuels. Those dreams can be worthy. But sometimes they function like a distraction, pulling our attention toward distant solutions while present waste continues unchallenged. It is easier to hope for the next invention than to reorganize the current machine. Yet reorganizing is where real change often lives. Imagine an industrial district designed like a body. Heat flows where it's needed. Exhaust becomes input. Data centers warm apartment blocks. Factories power nearby transit. Instead of isolated buildings, You have a system that behaves like a neighborhood ecosystem. The difference isn't science fiction. It's architecture, policy, and willingness. So the mystery here is not whether waste heat recovery is possible. It's why we accept the leak as normal. And the open question lingers, like warmth escaping into cold air. If we could build a future by simply closing the loops we already have, would we choose that kind of progress? Or would it feel too quiet to believe in? What if the most dangerous idea isn't a machine? It's a habit. In a small workshop, the most valuable tool is often not the most complex. It's the one that prevents you from making the same mistake twice. A caliper, a straight edge, a simple jig that keeps your hands honest. In the broader workshop of society, there is a tool like that too. It's not made of steel, it's made of expectation. And once you lose it, you begin to accept brokenness as normal. Durability is a strange kind of technology. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require a patent to be powerful. It's simply the decision, repeated across millions of design choices, to build things that keep working. There have been materials and manufacturing approaches over the last century that pointed toward a different consumer world. Paints that last longer, coatings that resist corrosion, textiles that endure, components engineered for easy replacement rather than total disposal. In some industries, durability became the standard because failure was too costly: aircraft, medical devices, critical infrastructure. But in everyday life, the incentives often ran the other way. When a refrigerator lasts 30 years, it becomes a family landmark. When it lasts 8, it becomes a routine purchase. Routine purchases power routine profits. The math doesn't require cruelty. It only requires a system that values throughput. And once throughput becomes the measure, better changes meaning. Better becomes lighter, cheaper, faster, more fashionable. Better becomes optimized for manufacturing instead of optimized for living. Products are designed like seasons. Even if they still function, they are made to feel outdated. Replacement becomes not an emergency, but a lifestyle. The cultural trick is subtle. We begin to experience maintenance as failure. A torn seam becomes a reason to buy a new jacket instead of learning to mend. A cracked phone screen becomes a reason to upgrade instead of repair. A worn part becomes a reason to replace the whole machine, because the machine was never designed to be opened. Screws become glue, batteries become sealed, manuals become proprietary. A product becomes a closed door. This shift didn't happen only because companies wanted it to. It happened because consumers adapted to it, because convenience is real, because time is scarce, and because the surrounding ecosystem, repair shops, spare parts, skilled labor, was allowed to thin out. When repair becomes rare, it becomes expensive. When it becomes expensive, replacement feels rational. The cycle feeds itself. And then, occasionally, something interrupts the pattern. A movement grows around the idea that people should be allowed to fix what they own. Technicians speak up. Farmers describe equipment that's software locked. Independent mechanics fight for access to diagnostic tools. Consumers realize that a device can be functionally fine and yet legally or practically unrepairable. The phrase "right to repair" becomes a kind of moral hinge, not just about fixing objects, but about reclaiming agency. The deeper tension here isn't only economic, it's psychological. Repair asks for patience, it asks for attention. It asks us to know a thing intimately enough to restore it. Replacement asks for nothing but a credit card. In a world that moves fast, replacement can feel like mercy. Repair can feel like friction. But friction is sometimes what keeps a culture from sliding into disposability. There's also the environmental cost, the quiet pile of broken things behind the bright storefronts. Electronics shipped to distant places, dismantled under dangerous conditions, plastics drifting into water, metals mined again and again, all because the objects we use are treated as temporary, even when their materials are not. Durability, then, becomes more than a feature. It becomes a philosophy, a willingness to value the long relationship over the quick transaction. It is the belief that a product should accompany a life, not merely decorate it for a season. And if that belief sounds quaint, consider how quickly it returns when the system fails. During shortages, during disasters, during economic strain, people rediscover repair like a lost language. They solder, they patch, they improvise, they keep things alive. Necessity reveals what convenience concealed, that we are capable of stewardship. So the mystery isn't whether we can build things that last. We can. The mystery is whether we want an economy that can survive it. Because if objects stop breaking, industries must reinvent themselves around service, upgrading, modularity, and care around helping people keep what they already have instead of pushing them toward what they don't. And that leaves us with a quiet question, as intimate as the tools in a drawer. If we measured progress not by how fast we replace our lives, but by how well we maintain them, what kind of future would we finally be able to afford? What if the future arrived once, quietly, and we asked it to leave? In a museum, the electric car looks like a polite ancestor. Rounded edges, wooden trim. A cabin that feels more like a sitting room than a cockpit. In the early 1900s, electric vehicles weren't a punchline. They were a serious contender. They were clean, quiet, and, compared to the gasoline cars of the day, surprisingly civilized. No hand cranking, no gasoline smell on your sleeves, no sputtering engines refusing to wake up in cold weather. For a brief moment, the road ahead seemed undecided. Then, the world chose speed. Gasoline cars improved rapidly. The electric starter made them easier to use. Mass production made them cheaper. Oil became abundant, and infrastructure grew around it like vines around a fence. Filling stations, repair shops, supply chains, advertising. Meanwhile, batteries remained heavy, expensive, and limited. Electric cars didn't fail so much as they fell behind a system that began to favor what could travel farther, faster, and cheaper under the rules that were being written. And those rules hardened into culture. The car became not just transportation, but identity. The open road became a national poem. Distance became a kind of freedom. Electric vehicles, tied to range and charging, felt like a compromise, a modest life in a world intoxicated by expansion. Decades passed. Gasoline engines grew powerful. Cities grew wide. The air grew thick in places where traffic never slept. Then, late in the 20th century, electric cars returned, not as antiques, but as prototypes for something new. They appeared in small fleets, in limited releases, in test programs that hinted at a different direction. Some drivers described them like a revelation: smooth acceleration, silence at stoplights, the strange pleasure of moving without vibration. For a second time, the road ahead seemed undecided. But the modern world is built on momentum, and momentum is hard to interrupt. Electric vehicles didn't only face technical problems, they faced a landscape shaped by gasoline assumptions. Fuel was quick, ubiquitous, normalized. Car dealerships were trained to sell and service combustion engines. Mechanics were built around their complexity. Oil companies, of course, had a stake in maintaining demand. But so did countless smaller actors: suppliers, advertisers, insurers. municipal budgets dependent on fuel taxes, and entire communities whose livelihoods were tied to the existing machine. Even well-meaning institutions hesitated. Regulators weighed costs. Utilities worried about load. Consumers worried about range and charging. Automakers worried about liability, margins, and the risk of betting on a future the public might not accept. And when a technology threatens to reorder many industries at once, the resistance doesn't have to be coordinated to be powerful. It can be 1,000 separate cautions that add up to a wall. There is also the question of timing. Electric cars depend on batteries, and batteries depend on chemistry, mining, manufacturing scale, and steady incremental improvements. The early modern EVs were often ahead of their ecosystem. Charging networks were thin, battery costs were high, public confidence was fragile. Under those conditions, any setback, any recall, any negative headline, any internal corporate shift could be enough to pull the plug. And so again, some electric programs ended. Some vehicles were taken off the road before their drivers were ready to say goodbye. Some prototypes became footnotes. Some were remembered with a particular kind of grief, not just disappointment, but the feeling of being teased by a future that briefly became real and then evaporated. Still, something changed the second time around. People had felt it. They had driven it. They had experienced the quiet, the absence of exhaust, the simple elegance of fewer moving parts. Once you've lived with that silence, it's hard to forget it. And history has a way of circling back when conditions shift. Batteries improved, climate concerns sharpened, cities grew tired of smog. Technology that once seemed like restraint began to look like relief. This is why the electric car story matters, even without a single clean villain to blame. It's a lesson in how progress can be stalled not by impossibility, but by misalignment, when the invention is ready before the world is willing to reorganize around it. So here's the question that lingers like the hum of a motor you can barely hear. When we look back and say, it wasn't the right time, are we describing technology or are we describing ourselves? What if the cure for waste was never a miracle invention, just a return policy? On a summer morning in an older neighborhood, you can almost hear how life used to move. A delivery truck rattles by. A screen door slaps shut. Somewhere, glass clinks. Milk bottles, soda bottles, jars meant to travel a short loop, factory to home and back again. The sound is small, domestic, forgettable. And yet, it carries a radical idea that a container isn't trash the moment it's emptied. For much of the 20th century, refillable packaging was normal in many places. Bottles were collected, washed, and reused. It wasn't perfect. Breakage happened, sanitation mattered, systems required coordination. But it worked because the economy was built to expect the loop. Deposits made the return worthwhile. Distribution routes were designed around retrieval. Companies had infrastructure for cleaning and refilling. A bottle wasn't a disposable object, it was a working asset. Then convenience arrived, packaged as progress. Lightweight, single-use containers offered speed. No need to wash, no need to retrieve, no need to store empty bottles behind the store. Manufacturers could ship farther without worrying about return logistics. Retailers could stock shelves without managing deposits. Consumers could toss and forget. The system sounded efficient, especially when landfill space seemed endless and plastic was cheap. But what looked like efficiency was often just deferred cost. Because away isn't a place, it's a direction. As disposable packaging became dominant, waste surged. Cities expanded landfill capacity. Incinerators rose in some regions. Litter became a background texture of highways and shorelines. Oceans received what society didn't want to see. And then, almost as an apology, a new word rose to prominence: recycling. Recycling promised to keep the disposable world without the guilt. Put it in the right bin, and the story ends happily. Bottles become bottles again. Plastic becomes new products. We keep the convenience, lose the consequence. But recycling, especially for plastics, has always been more complicated than the slogans. Different resins behave differently. Contamination ruins batches. Collection systems vary by region. Markets fluctuate. Transport costs bite. Sometimes the material is downcycled into lower-grade products that eventually become waste anyway. Sometimes it's shipped far away. Sometimes it's landfilled after being collected because the economics don't work that month. In other words, recycling is not a magic eraser. It's an industry with margins, infrastructure, and limits. And here's the uncomfortable irony. In many cases, reusing a container repeatedly can be simpler and more effective than trying to recycle mountains of single-use material. A refillable glass bottle can make dozens of trips. A durable plastic crate can replace countless cardboard boxes. A standardized container can move through a system like a library book, not a paper towel. So why did the loop weaken? Partly because the loop asks for shared responsibility. Deposits require participation. Return systems require storage space and labor. Washing facilities require investment. Standardization can clash with branding, and branding is one of the strongest forces in modern commerce. A disposable container is a billboard you can redesign every season. A reusable container is quieter. It asks a company to compete on product quality, not on the constant reinvention of packaging. There's also the hard truth that once disposable infrastructure expands, once you have factories optimized for single-use production and municipalities geared toward waste management, it becomes easier to keep feeding that system than to pivot away from it. The world begins to behave like it's committed, even if the commitment is harming it. And yet, the loop keeps returning, like a forgotten melody. Some cities and countries strengthen deposit return schemes and see higher collection rates. Some companies experiment with refill stations. Some communities revive local bottle reuse. The idea shows up in unexpected forms. Shipping containers designed for many cycles, packaging as a service, concentrated products that reduce container use, durable systems that treat material like a resource instead of a nuisance. These aren't fantasy solutions. They're organizational solutions. And organizational solutions are often the most threatening because they shift power. They reduce demand for virgin material. They reduce waste hauling. They reduce the need for end-of-pipe fixes. They ask industries built around extraction and disposability to adapt. So here's the question, simple enough to fit on the bottom of a bottle. When we call reuse inconvenient, are we describing a problem of engineering, or are we describing the discomfort of living in a culture that forgot how to bring things back? What if the cleanest engine is the one that refuses to waste motion? On a highway, you can feel the inefficiency in your teeth, the vibration of the road, the hiss of tires, the surge of power to overcome friction and air, only to dissolve into heat the moment you lift your foot. It's the strange bargain of modern mobility. We burn dense fuel to create movement, and then we throw much of that movement away. Every time you brake, a small tragedy repeats. Kinetic energy, your vehicle's forward momentum, vanishes as heat in the brake pads. The air warms by an amount too small to notice, but multiplied by millions of cars, buses and trains across years, it becomes a vast, invisible loss. We accept it because it's how we learn to stop. But engineers have long known another possibility. What if slowing down could also be charging up? Regenerative braking is a deceptively elegant idea. When a vehicle decelerates, instead of converting motion into heat, it converts motion into electricity. The motor becomes a generator. Energy flows back into a battery or storage system. The vehicle doesn't just stop, it recovers. It treats momentum not as something to be destroyed, but as something to be harvested. In some forms, the concept has been around for a long time, particularly in electric rail systems, where trains can feed power back into the grid or into other trains on the line. But in road vehicles, widespread adoption took longer. Not because the idea was impossible, but because the ecosystem had to catch up. Batteries needed to handle frequent charge cycles. Power electronics needed to be reliable and affordable. Motors needed control systems sophisticated enough to make the braking feel natural to drivers. And manufacturers had to see value in an efficiency gain that might reduce fuel sales and service revenue tied to traditional wear and tear. When regenerative braking finally began to appear in hybrids and electric vehicles, many drivers described the sensation like learning a new dialect of motion. The car slowed as you eased off the accelerator. Braking became smoother, more anticipatory. In some cases, you could drive with a single pedal, using the motor's resistance to decelerate while replenishing the battery. The vehicle felt less like a machine fighting physics and more like a system negotiating with it. It's one of those technologies that feels obvious once you've experienced it, which makes its late arrival feel like a mystery. How could something so sensible take so long to become normal? The answer lives in the in-between spaces where technology meets habit. Regenerative braking challenges the old model in small but meaningful ways. It reduces brake wear, which can reduce maintenance revenue for parts suppliers and service networks built around frequent replacements. It improves efficiency, which reduces fuel consumption in hybrids, good for drivers, less thrilling for those who profit from volume. It pairs naturally with electrification, which threatens whole categories of engine components and the businesses that supply them. Again, this isn't a single coordinated effort to keep a secret. It's the inertia of a mature system. Industries grow like forests, thick, interdependent, resistant to sudden change. A new technology doesn't just compete with an old one, it competes with the entire web of contracts, training, tooling, marketing, and expectations that surround the old one. There's also the psychological side. The way a car feels matters. Drivers trust what they know. Braking is deeply instinctive. If regeneration feels unfamiliar, if it changes pedal response, if it makes new sounds, if it introduces new failure modes, it can trigger hesitation. Consumers may not reject it consciously, but adoption slows when the experience doesn't match muscle memory. And yet, once the logic enters the mainstream, it's hard to argue against it. Recovering energy is not a luxury feature. It's a philosophy of respect. It says, don't waste what you already have. Don't throw away motion that cost you fuel, money, and air quality to create. In a broader sense, regenerative braking is a metaphor for what mature societies struggle to do. We generate enormous momentum, economic, cultural, infrastructural. And when it's time to slow down, we often burn that momentum into friction and resentment. We lose what could have been converted into something useful, learning, adaptation. continuity. So here's the question that lingers every time you approach a red light. If we can design machines that reclaim their own energy instead of destroying it, what would it look like to build a culture that does the same? One that slows down without wasting everything it took to get here. What if the most powerful transportation technology is the one we keep postponing? There's a particular silence on an empty rail platform. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a question unanswered. You stand under fluorescent lights, watching a track stretch into distance, and you can almost feel the future that could arrive here if someone decided it mattered. High-speed rail is not a new dream. It's an old one, tested and refined in places that treated time as a shared resource. The idea is simple. Move large numbers of people quickly, safely, and efficiently between major cities without turning every trip into an individual burden. It's the promise of motion, without the constant tax of traffic, airport queues, and short-haul flights that burn fuel to rise, descend, and rise again. If you've ever watched a train slide in at near-silent speed, you know the sensation. It doesn't feel like spectacle. It feels like competence, like a society that has decided to respect the hours of its citizens. And yet, in the United States, high-speed rail has remained more like a rumor than a norm, an idea that appears in plans, speeches, and glossy renderings, then fades back into delay. Projects begin and stall, budgets expand and shrink, timelines bend into decades. The tracks remain, but the future doesn't arrive. Why? Part of it is geography. The US is vast, and many cities are spread far apart. But that explanation only goes so far. There are corridors where rail would make clear sense, densely populated regions with heavy travel demand. The deeper barriers are woven into the country's infrastructure habits: land acquisition, permitting, political cycles, funding models, and the simple reality that it's easier to maintain what already exists than to build what requires coordination across states, agencies, and interest groups. Then there is the competition. Airlines have built a system designed to move people quickly between major hubs. Automobiles dominate regional travel. Highway construction, suburban zoning, and decades of car-centered planning have made driving not merely a choice, but often the only practical option. In that environment, high-speed rail isn't just an engineering project. It's a challenge to the existing order of movement. It threatens the short-haul flight market. It threatens car dependency in key corridors. It changes the logic of development, making city centers more valuable and distance less isolating. It shifts investment away from road expansion. It alters what commuting can mean. And because it changes so many pieces at once, it can trigger resistance from many directions, not always loud, not always coordinated, but persistent. Even when people support it in principle, the details become a battlefield. Where should the line go? Who pays? Who gets the station? Who bears the construction disruption? Who controls the contracts? Which neighborhoods are affected? Each question is legitimate, and each question can become a lever for delay. Meanwhile, the private experience of travel continues to fray. Airports become more crowded. Highways thicken with traffic. Time is consumed in small increments, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, until it adds up to years of human life spent waiting, idling, detouring. We accept it because it is familiar, because we've organized our days around it, because we've been taught that this is simply what movement costs. But what if it doesn't have to? High-speed rail at its best is not only about speed, it's about reliability. You arrive at a station in the heart of a city, not 40 miles outside it. You board without the rituals of surrender. Shoes off, liquids bagged, identity scanned like a barcode. You sit, you read, you talk, you watch the landscape pass like a film. The trip becomes time you can use, not time you must endure. In that sense, the technology isn't just steel and electricity. It's a different relationship with the body, a different way of treating travel as part of life rather than an interruption of it. And perhaps that is why it remains so difficult. Not because the trains can't be built, but because building them would mean admitting that the current system is a choice, not fate. So here's the open question. Waiting like a train that hasn't been scheduled yet. If the future we want requires us to think together, fund together, plan together, build together, are we willing to do that kind of work? Or will we keep calling the delay practical while our time disappears down the highway? What if the most valuable invention is the one that makes nothing new? In a laboratory, there's a moment every researcher learns to love. The moment a material behaves the way it shouldn't. A coating that refuses to corrode. A polymer that holds its strength under stress. A surface that sheds grime like rain off a leaf. It feels like discovering a secret rule of matter, something the universe kept quiet until you asked the right question. And then, outside the lab, that secret meets the real world. Procurement departments, maintenance schedules, warranty math, supply contracts, the slow, grinding machinery of how things are done. There have been materials over the past century, sometimes coatings, sometimes composites, sometimes simple changes in formulation, that dramatically extended the life of everyday objects. Corrosion-resistant treatments that could help bridges and pipelines endure longer. Industrial paints that could reduce repainting cycles. Plastics and rubbers designed for longevity instead of quick degradation. Even textiles engineered to resist wear far beyond what retail fashion typically demands. None of this sounds like science fiction. That's the point. These are not miracle rays. They are incremental, practical improvements that add up to something radical. Fewer replacements. And fewer replacements is where the trouble begins, because a product that lasts longer makes less noise in the economy. It quietly reduces demand for raw materials. It shrinks the market for replacement parts. It lowers the frequency of purchases. It changes the rhythm of consumption that many industries have grown accustomed to. The result is not always open suppression. More often, it's a softer disappearance, a promising formulation that never gets marketed widely, a durable version that exists only in premium lines, a part that could be replaceable, made instead into a sealed unit, a repair manual that becomes restricted, a material that could last 20 years, chosen instead to last 8 because 8 fits the warranty curve, the cost targets, and the quarterly reports. In some cases, durability is treated as a liability. If something lasts too long, it can outlive the company's support infrastructure. It can lead to mismatched components. It can complicate upgrades. It can reduce repeat engagement. In a world where success is measured by ongoing transactions, durability can feel like silence, and silence can be misread as stagnation. But durability also carries a different kind of power, the power to free attention. When objects fail less, people spend less time shopping for replacements, less time troubleshooting, less time dealing with the small humiliations of a life constantly interrupted by breakdowns. A durable world is a calmer world. It's a world where the background noise of maintenance drops and human attention can return to higher things, relationships, craft, learning, rest. This is why The question of longevity isn't just technical, it's cultural. We live in a society that often equates novelty with vitality. A new model, a new version, a new release, these are treated like proof that we're moving forward. But there's another definition of forward, not the constant arrival of new things, but the gradual reduction of preventable failure. A bridge that doesn't need constant patching is progress. A water system that leaks less is progress. An appliance that can be repaired with a common tool is progress. A phone designed so its battery can be swapped is progress. A jacket built to be mended, a shoe built to be resoled, a chair built to be reupholstered, these are not quaint. They are technologies of continuity. And continuity can feel threatening because it slows the churn. This is where the conversation returns to the warehouse of forgotten possibilities. Sometimes the suppressed discovery isn't hidden in a crate. It's hidden in plain sight as an option not taken. The durable version exists, but it's not the default. The repairable design is possible, but it's not encouraged. The long-lasting material is available, but it's priced as a luxury, as if permanence itself should be reserved for the wealthy. If that sounds like an exaggeration, consider how often longevity is sold today, as a premium feature, as a boutique lifestyle, as a brand identity. Permanence becomes a product category rather than a baseline expectation. So here's the question that hangs in the air like dust in a sunbeam. If we can make things that last, why do we keep treating lasting as exceptional when it could be the simplest, quietest form of progress we've ever had? What if the most promising medicine isn't a pill at all, but a living relationship? In a dim hospital corridor, the kind with linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that never feel like daylight, a nurse changes a dressing. The smell of antiseptic hangs in the air, clean, sharp, almost metallic. Down the hall, a patient's fever refuses to break. A doctor studies lab results and sees a word that has become more common in modern medicine than anyone wanted: resistant. Antibiotics were once described with reverence, as if humanity had finally found a way to outsmart the invisible. A scratch that could have killed became a minor inconvenience. Pneumonia became treatable. Surgery became safer. Entire lifetimes expanded because infections retreated. For a while, it felt like the victory was permanent. But bacteria, older than every human institution, adapted. Resistance is evolution at high speed, and the modern world has provided bacteria with endless training. Antibiotics used when they aren't needed. Incomplete courses. Overuse in agriculture. Hospital environments where the toughest strains survive. The result is a slow, rising fear that we are drifting toward an era where routine infections regain their old authority. And in the shadow of that fear, an older idea returns, one that feels almost too strange for modern medicine, and yet deeply logical once you understand it: bacteriophages. Phages are viruses that infect bacteria. They are nature's bacterial predators, abundant in oceans, soil, and even inside us. Long before antibiotics became the dominant story, scientists explored phage therapy, using these viruses to target specific bacterial infections. The appeal is almost poetic. Instead of carpet bombing the body's microbiome, you send a precise hunter after the culprit. In some parts of the world, phage research never fully disappeared. Clinics continued experimenting. Researchers refined methods. Case reports accumulated. Meanwhile, in much of Western medicine, phage therapy remained on the margins, seen as complicated, inconsistent, or too difficult to standardize. And here again, The tension isn't only scientific, it's structural. Antibiotics fit neatly into an industrial model. Manufacture a stable compound, test it, patent it, distribute it globally, prescribe it widely. A phage, by contrast, is living and specific. It may need to be matched to a particular bacterial strain. It can evolve. It can behave differently in different environments. It can demand rapid diagnostics and custom preparations. In other words, it asks medicine to become more flexible, more personalized, more responsive. That's not inherently bad, but it clashes with the machinery of modern healthcare, which prefers predictability. There are also market realities. A broad-spectrum antibiotic can be sold at scale. A targeted biological therapy may be harder to package into a single product line. Patents become more complicated. Clinical trials become more complex. Regulatory frameworks, built for stable chemicals, can struggle with something that behaves like an organism. So the suppression, if it exists, is often not a locked drawer. It's a mismatch between what a system is built to handle and what an idea requires to thrive. And yet, the need keeps pressing. As resistance grows, interest returns. Researchers explore phage cocktails. Labs develop faster ways to identify bacterial strains. Compassionate use cases appear when antibiotics fail. The old idea begins to feel less like fringe science and more like a missing tool we can no longer afford to ignore. But phage therapy is only one chapter in a larger story, the rediscovery of the microbiome. In recent years, science has begun to describe the human body not as a fortress, but as an ecosystem. Trillions of microbes live on and within us, shaping digestion, immunity, even mood and metabolism. When antibiotics wipe out bacteria indiscriminately, they don't only remove threats, they disrupt communities. Sometimes the disruption heals. Sometimes it invites other problems. The body is not a battlefield where only victory matters. It's a garden where balance matters too. This shift in thinking is quietly radical. It reframes medicine away from permanent domination and toward ongoing stewardship. Instead of asking, how do we kill the enemy, it asks, how do we restore the conditions for health? That question can feel inconvenient in a world that prefers quick fixes. Stewardship is slow. It requires diagnosis, patience, and humility. It forces us to admit that we are not separate from nature. We are made of it. And so the mystery at the heart of this chapter isn't whether phages will save us or whether the microbiome holds all answers. The mystery is cultural. Are we willing to build healthcare systems that treat living complexity as normal rather than treating it as a problem to be simplified? Because if the future of medicine is not just chemistry, but ecology, then the most powerful discovery may be the oldest one of all, that health is not a product you buy, but a relationship you tend. What if the real story isn't what was suppressed, but what we kept choosing anyway? Return to that warehouse one last time. The dust is still there. The crates haven't moved. But now, the objects inside feel different. Not like relics of a stolen future, but like mirrors held up to the present. A plant-based panel, a long-lived light, rails buried under pavement, a farm designed as a loop, heat that could have been reused, machines built to last, vehicles that reclaim their own motion, transit that treats time as communal, medicine that behaves like ecology. None of these ideas are perfect on their own. Some are romanticized, some are technically difficult, some are limited by geography, economics, or unintended consequences. But together, they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss. The future is not only invented, It is negotiated, and negotiation is where we tend to lose our innocence. Because the moment an idea becomes real, built, tested, ready to scale, it stops being pure. It enters the world of budgets, permits, lobbying, liability, supply chains, and consumer psychology. It enters the world where a better solution can be inconvenient to those who profit from the current one. It enters the world where change threatens jobs even as it promises cleaner air, where a new system might be morally appealing but practically disruptive, where every improvement forces a question no invention can answer on its own: who pays, who benefits, and who is asked to adapt. That's why the word suppressed can be both useful and misleading. Useful because it points to a real phenomenon, that powerful incentives can slow adoption, narrow options, or bury alternatives under bureaucracy and ridicule. Misleading because it suggests a single hidden hand, when history is usually shaped by many visible hands pulling in different directions, each for reasons that make sense in isolation, even if the combined result is tragedy. If there is a villain in these stories, it is often the same one wearing 1,000 faces. Short-term thinking. Short-term thinking builds products that fail because replacement is profitable. It builds cities that sprawl because widening roads is easier than reshaping neighborhoods. It builds energy systems that leak because venting heat is cheaper than capturing it. It builds agriculture that exports fertility because buying fertilizer is simpler than rebuilding soil. It builds medicine that treats life like a target instead of an ecosystem. Short-term thinking doesn't announce itself as greed. It announces itself as realism, as practicality, as how the world works. But sometimes, practicality is just a story we tell to defend a choice we're afraid to change. The hopeful truth is that none of these roads are closed forever. A society can relearn repair. A city can rebuild transit. An economy can reward durability. A farm can become a loop again. A factory can treat waste heat as value. A container can be designed for return, not disposal. Medicine can become more precise and more humble. The future can be rewritten, not by a single breakthrough, but by 1,000 decisions made differently. That kind of change is slower than a miracle and less dramatic than a conspiracy. It's harder to film, harder to sell, harder to mythologize, but it's also more realistic. It places responsibility where it belongs, not in a hidden room, but in the daily mechanisms of policy, design, and culture. So if you take anything from this journey, let it be this: the past is full of inventions, but it is also full of values. Every technology carries an assumption about what we want: speed or steadiness, growth or resilience, novelty or repair, extraction or renewal, control or relationship. And here is the final question: simple, human, and unresolved. When the next threatening discovery arrives, the one that could make our lives cleaner, calmer, and more durable, will we recognize it as progress if it asks us to buy less, waste less, and slow down? Or will we call it impractical and send it quietly to the warehouse, where so many possible futures are still waiting for someone to open the door?